So Daryl is the principal and founder of Davis Systems, which is a consulting firm that helps develop agile, high-performance software teams. He has extensive experience in certifications, including TSP Mentor Coach, PSP Instructor, CMMI Instructor, and Lead Appraiser. He's certified by the PMI as Project Manager. He's a certified professional Scrum Master and Scrum Product Owner. And then prior to starting Davis Systems, Daryl was a software developer and senior technical manager at a variety of software organizations. So please please join me in welcoming Daryl Davis. So thank you. And one other thing, Daryl, I just want to make a very quick mention. This presentation will be recorded, so just want to make sure everyone's aware of that. Okay.
Great, thank you, Julie. Yeah, I thought about 20 years ago we met. Wow, it was a long time. And we go a long way back with software process improvement together as well. Julia was at the SEI when we moved to Pittsburgh. So it's been great working with you and many of you over the years. So today I'm going to present on something, if you've known me for a long time, you've heard me talk about this many times before, a framework for software development excellence. And this is something that I have applied for many years, and I'm just gradually getting around to sharing these ideas more and more, and putting them down on paper in the forms of presentations like this more explicitly. The last big presentation I did on this was several years ago at the TSP Symposium in Mexico. And in that, I covered some of the very high-level concepts in the framework. Today, what I want to do is really go in kind of the second level of detail on this framework. And I hope you get more out of that as we go into the depth. It does mean we have quite a bit to cover today, so I'm going to move fairly quickly through the slides. I do want to invite questions as we go. And please come on with audio if you have questions, if I'm going too fast and you want to talk about something. Okay, so my objective here is to describe what I call a unifying framework that's fairly broad of the most important traits, principles, and practices supporting the achievement of software product excellence. So what do I mean by software product excellence? Well, one of the ideas we've heard, and this mainly comes from the Agile world, the Agile community, is it's important both to build the right things and to build the things right. And we've added to that more recently the importance of building at the right speed, okay? So some methods and some approaches focus more on building the right things. And in other words, defining and understanding and elaborating what it is that the users and the customers actually need. The other focus is more on building the things right. And that is to say, once we know what a customer needs, the user needs are, let's do an effective job at building something that's high quality, that's reliable, and so on. And the third consideration is building at the right speed, getting out there to meet the customer's needs in a timely manner, having the agility to react to change, and not missing market opportunities. So really all three of these are important, and our target is the sweet spot in the middle of that. And if we look at any two of these three, we're missing some things. So the idea here is to really try to balance building the right thing, building the thing right, and building at the right speed. Now, at Davis Systems, we've been doing this, helping clients do this since 1993. And for years before that, at Intergraph Corporation, I was leading process improvement efforts there. And over the years, I've seen many, many methods come and go. And I've seen some be very successful and stick around. And some are more popular than others. So we've used things like the personal software process and the team software process. We've used Scrum. We've used other Agile methods. And when I say we, that's both Davis Systems and on some projects we've taken on our own to develop for clients, but mainly through clients coaching them and helping them make improvement efforts. CMMI is going, including the good old software CMM. We've got many years of experience with that. But more and more, we're using the best of various combinations of these methods. So what I do today, even if someone brings us in to help them and say, hey, we want to get started with Scrum, or we want to do team software process. What we've learned over the years is there's many good ideas, and no one of these methods incorporates all of those ideas. The best methods cover much of it, but still there's room for improvement by keeping an open mind and looking at good ideas from other methods. The challenge is, how do you integrate this? One of the advancements, in a sense, is that we have methods developed today where they have frameworks so that the individual practices are made to fit together and support each other. And that's an important idea in Scrum. It's an important idea in the team software process. It's important in extreme programming, is that you have sort of a framework that ties together the individual practices and helps make them more effective. But what happens if we want to apply more than just one framework, right? And get the best ideas from many of these. And that's really what the framework that I'm describing today and that we use attempts to do, is to say, let's find those commonalities that are common strengths from these different methods, and let's figure out what's the environment to make them work together, so that we're not just necessarily stuck with one method. We can have core methods that we're relying on, but we can incorporate new ideas into that framework. So we want to unify the most effective ideas from different leading software communities, such as the Agile community and the team software process community. And those of us who have experience in both of those know that these communities kind of developed in parallel and on their own without a lot of overlap or even awareness of what the others were doing. And it's more recently that some of us have had that experience enough in both environments to see ways to do this blended approach. So again, this is my attempt to capture guidance that I've already been using and be able to better explain it to other people, that, how do we do this unification of these different approaches. So when I talk about these leading software communities, what are they? Well, two of the main ones are the capability maturity model, which is now called capability maturity model integration. The work out of the SEI and Watts Humphrey, going many years back, led these efforts. And the initial implementations against the CMMI model being more an abstract model, telling you practices that you needed to achieve, what to do, but not how to do them. It didn't give you a specific operational process. So most of the initial implementations were what I'm calling homegrown processes. And if you've been through that journey from CMMI level 1 to level 5, that's a lot of sort of like trial and error, if you will, of saying, okay, here's the requirement in CMM. How do we meet this? What practices do we put in place? And it can take a while. It can take a decade if you're moving fast to move from CMMI level 1 to CMMI level 5 if you don't have more guidance. Well, Watts came to realize this was an issue, and he also realized people were having trouble scaling this down to smaller teams. So he developed the team software process, Watts Humphrey, as an actual operational process with practices and a framework that fit these practices together as an implementation of CMMI level 5 for individual teams. And that's proven very effective. Meanwhile, in the Agile world, we had a very big movement that's become very popular. We have methods like Scrum and extreme programming and many others that have really taken over the world in a sense that they really have changed the world in the broad appeal of those methods. Much of that appeal coming from the fact that they're freely available, you can pick them up, individual teams can empower themselves in a sense to take on these Agile and Scrum. But why do I call these leading? Well, I've had a lot of experience with these, and I've been able to see for myself how we can achieve very high performance, very high quality applying these methods. But if you don't want to believe me, and you shouldn't, just believe one person, I'd like to point out this is a report by Capers-Jones. This was a 2013 report he did. Capers-Jones is one of the most thorough analysts in the software engineering world of data from a variety of methods, none of which he's particularly married to, but he has a rich data set and is really good at doing analysis. And his 2013 report looks at this from several aspects. One is development speed and cost. And I can't go through all these numbers in the time we have, but you can see all the detailed references are at the end of the slide deck if you want to dig deeper. In green, I've highlighted the top performers here. So development speed and cost, this is just talking about the time from beginning development through the end of development in delivering a product. Just those costs and just that schedule time. So if you're strictly looking at what's a fast method, what methods help you accelerate getting something out to market, these are the ones that came out on top in Jones' analysis. We have extreme programming, Agile with Scrum. So this is primarily Scrum, but using some of the ideas also supported by the Agile Manifesto. The team software process and CMMI level 5 in general, using a spiral model of development. And if you look at those numbers, I highlighted all of those in green because they're virtually a tie with each other. Their schedule months and their development costs both are very close to each other. And you see it's really good performance compared to, if you look at the very bottom, CMMI level 1 with waterfall. If you imagine that's as being kind of the industry standard, and you know, we say there's always another level 1 company out there, still much of the industry is operating at that level, and having those famous software failures are still out there. So it's quite a jump from to the green leading efforts from where a CMM level 1 would be. And you can see that also compared to what CMMI level 3 with iterative process and rational unified process, how that stands. So those methods all looking good for development speed and cost. But what about quality? Now, we could get something out pretty quick, but are we getting it out with quality? And that has long-term implications for cost and satisfaction of the users and future maintenance. If we're delivering a lot of defects to the field, we're going to have to spend a lot of time, extra time fixing those defects, extra time in maintenance on future releases. It's going to become slower and slower and slower to maintain and enhance the same products. So the quality aspect, when we look at Capers' analysis here, team software process comes out on top along with CMMI level 5 with spiral. Agile with Scrum is down comparable to CMMI level 3 kind of capability, right? So quite a difference here. We saw that Agile and the other Agile methods in general are right up there on speed, but not so much on quality, okay? And what about the economics, the long-term economics of this? If we look at the total cost of quality, the total cost of ownership, again, the team software process and CMMI level 5 with spiral are up near the top. Still, if we look at the Agile methods, they're much better than CMMI level 1. And you know, maybe this is part of the problem, if pretty much if you do anything that's a reasonably good method like Scrum, you're going to see some huge improvements. But one problem with that is some organizations, I think, see those big improvements and say, we're done, right? So one of the things I want to emphasize is there's still so much more potential if we don't start with Scrum, let's say, and stop with Scrum. And Scrum itself doesn't promote that. Scrum itself builds in the idea of continuous learning and continuous improvement. So how do we go about doing that? How do we guide organizations in doing that? So focusing on Scrum and TSP, both have their strengths. Scrum is far more popular, and it's more completely addresses something that's very, very important, and that's building the right product. TSP focuses more on building the product in the right way, so it's much more effective in quality, it's much more effective in the long-term cost, the cost of quality, the total cost of ownership. But even TSP suffers from, or could be enhanced by more focus on building the product right. So our emphasis has been on building a framework to try to unify these different approaches, the very, very popular approaches that are out there, along with the strengths of methods like TSP. So these have become the two main bases for our framework, our Scrum and TSP. So where Scrum's scope intersects with TSP's, if you look at it closely, Scrum is actually almost a strict subset of TSP. Now, as I just said, Scrum addresses better building the right product. It talks about the product owner role. It talks more about a product backlog and how to maintain that and work with the team to make sure they understand stakeholder needs and so on. And those are very important practices. But there are other parts of Scrum that talk about building the product right. And when we look at those parts of Scrum, they're very similar actually to TSP in the sense that, as a subset of what's in TSP, right? So what we do in our framework is we use ideas from TSP to guide good basic implementations of Scrum, because TSP is very rich in guidance. It's an actual process, an operational process. And you can look at that process and the practices in that process and the methods to put together a good implementation of Scrum. We can also use more ideas from TSP to guide continued improvement from basic Scrum. So once you've got Scrum in an organization, how do they improve? Well, a big part of that is through looking at their own performance and saying, okay, here's where we're missing, here are the opportunities for improvement. So what do we do next? TSP practices can provide some guidance for that. And also, if you think about TSP, one of the things we've struggled with over the years, TSP is a level 5 process at the team level. It can be very difficult to jump right into a level 5 process. So one of the things I've been preaching for many years is an incremental approach to implementing TSP. And that is to say, rather than one big bang to level 1 perhaps to level 5 TSP, can we do something that's softer and something that's more popular? So what I'm suggesting is we can start with Scrum. Scrum is a good first step. It's very popular. Most organizations are already doing some or all of Scrum. And even if they're not doing it, they often have people who are familiar with it, and there are many resources on Scrum available for people to pick it up on their own, teams to pick it up on their own. Scrum and TSP are both based on empirical process control. This idea that we have visibility into the process because the process is defined. We have intermediate outputs that we can look at in that defined process. We can see if those outputs are in line with our process standards and our plans, and we can make adjustments as necessary to achieve desired results. So these two approaches really have the same theoretical basis, the same core here. The terminology used for that in the Scrum world and most of the Agile world is transparency. Transparency is that visibility into what's actually happening. In TSP, the TSP world, we often talk about this through actually using measurement to say, these are the things we measure, and these are our goals, our parameters for where we want those measures to fall. And if we fall outside of those measures, we need to be aware of that. So that's inspection. Inspection is comparing where you actually are to where you plan to be, to where your processes said you should be. And making adjustments is the adaptation part, to say if we're falling outside of our plans and our processes and our standards, we either need to take some corrective action to get back in line with those processes and plans and standards, or we need to adjust the plans and processes and standards if they were wrong. Okay, so same idea in both worlds there. So core to the framework is this idea of controlling through that kind of feedback. Scrum and TSP both importantly target small, multidisciplinary, self-directed teams that plan and track their own work and make commitments. And this is something that we've learned is very, very key, is that focus on teams and empowering the teams to drive their own process improvement. The frontline workers, the people involved in the daily work, the people who have the expertise, they're the ones who really can deeply understand the problems. They're the ones who really can deeply come up with good, better solutions, as opposed to this being driven from outside the teams. This is something we've learned is so important. Both Scrum and TSP address planning and execution and use retrospectives for improvement. So in other words, you make a plan. This could be a plan at the beginning of each iteration. And these iterations in the Scrum world, these are called sprints. In the TSP world, they're called cycles. But the idea is the same. We work incrementally and we work iteratively, and we make plans for those increments. And as we execute, we track our progress against those plans. And if we're missing on the execution, we make adjustments. And then at the end of each of these iterations, we have a retrospective, which looks back on what just happened. And we say, how can we improve in the next iteration? What do we do to get better? And again, this is driving systematic continuous improvement and doing it in these small increments, these iterations as we do the work, which gives us lots of opportunity for continuous improvement. What TSP does more so than Scrum, so you can think of this as a more advanced practice, is it adds a very robust measurement and quality management framework along with specific operational guidance for how to accomplish these things. Now, when I presented this before back in 2016 at the TSP Symposium in Mexico, I hit the top level of the framework. And at the top level, I talked about important traits and principles, and I talked about the most important process areas. You can look back at this reference, Davis 16, that will point you to our website. Look at the library on the website, and you can download that presentation from the TSP Symposium, which has lots and lots of detail about these next two slides. I wanted to go into the next level, though, rather than focus just on this top level. So I'm just quickly going to mention the top level and invite you to go dig deeper in those slides if you would like. But these are important traits and principles across Agile and Scrum and the team software process that we found are very important. Some methods like Scrum call some of these things values. The TSP calls some of these things principles. They go by different names. But really, these are important supporting ideas beyond just the raw practices themselves. When you're doing the practices, these are the things that are important motivationally and in terms of what the team does. Commitment is one, and this means commitment to the goals that the team develops, commitment to the business goals, commitment to your fellow team members, and commitments between leadership and management and the team members. Very important to have those commitments established and that commitment discipline. That's probably the single biggest motivator is, we do these things to help other people, and we make commitments, we make promises, and then we work to achieve those promises. Participation, meaning we break down walls, we engage people with each other. We engage team members with each other, and we keep everyone involved to participate in the way that everyone is contributing voices and contributing value. Preparation includes things as basic as getting the training you need and having the materials and tools that you need, and doing your planning and developing the processes that you are going to need to use when you go to execute. Simplicity is a big one. Too many of the homegrown CMMI implementations ended up being extremely large, having extremely many measures, and this is where we often got bogged down in too much documentation, too much bureaucracy. What we found is the most effective methods, the most effective approaches really emphasize simplicity. And simplicity is harder than complexity to achieve. So it is something you have to work at. But the idea is to boil things down to their essence so that you have concise guidance, things that are easy to understand, and that's very important as well. Iteration and continuous feedback, we talked about those with the inspect and adapt ideas, same with regular adjustment. Objectivity means things like basing our decisions on actual measurements rather than flying by the seat of the pants and taking guesses. Eliminating the biases that are natural for us often that will disappear if we look at the facts more. Openness and communication. Now this includes things like making a safe environment for people to work together and speak up. Direct interaction. Many times I've told the story of Daryl's way of writing documents. You don't go off in a corner and write a document and email it to someone. You meet face to face and talk about the subjects, and you capture what you agree on. That's a much better way, that direct interaction, of getting understanding, having that high bandwidth communication, than to communicate through documents, let's say. The documentation is important to capture agreements and to capture details and so on. And continuous improvement we've talked about. Now, important practice areas, I can't overemphasize the importance of boiling down our processes to actual practices, what we actually need to do. And that's something that needs to cover all of these areas. Product management, technical excellence, quality management, teamwork, project management, and process management. So when we work on software excellence, we can't just focus on one of these and expect to be completely successful. All of these need attention. Now, when I presented this back in 2016, I had technical excellence underneath quality management. Based on the feedback and things I've thought about since then, I've raised technical excellence to the top level because it's just so important to have that good emphasis on design, construction, the standards that we use for that. And this is also where things like tool environment, continuous delivery, DevSecOps, those kind of things fall into that category as well. And we're recognizing just how extremely important those are. Okay, so now I want to go into the next level. Let's talk about the framework and components, okay? So what do I mean by a framework, and what are the parts of a framework? And I've mapped these to what's provided in Scrum and what's provided in the team software process. So the general framework is sort of like I described before. It's a skeleton through which our processes and our practices and all of our other components fit together and work together. And both Scrum and TSP provide general frameworks. Other parts are process definition, a measurement framework, common definitions, teams, and even more components. So process definition means defining the processes, procedures, criteria, and standards that your team is going to use. Scrum calls for these things. It says the team should develop and agree on them, but it's in sort of a CMM level too, if you're familiar with that concept way. It leaves it up to the teams to decide what those are, and doesn't provide in Scrum itself, in the Scrum guide, I'm saying by Scrum itself, a lot of explicit guidance on that. Now, many books have been written about how to implement Scrum that do give good examples of how those things should be done. And the TSP world is very explicit. We actually provide a process definition. But even that process definition isn't meant to be one size fits all. It's meant to be kind of a standard example of a good implementation, which teams can then tailor and derive from. The measurement framework, again, Scrum, a basic Scrum implementation implies a measurement framework. It doesn't actually call out what your measures should be, but it more says what they should accomplish. So we know in Scrum that the objective is to have that transparency and to be able to control your quality and your progress. And again, they're kind of standard methods. We've all heard of velocity and tracking burn down or burn up. These are kind of standard approaches to measurement used in Scrum. TSP provides a more complete measurement framework for doing these things. Common definitions. When team members and people within the organization communicate with each other, they need to be using the same terminology and understand precisely what that means. Team-centered, we've talked about the importance of that. Other components are defined roles, events, artifacts, and rules. Okay, so process definition, a little more detail. I'm going to move along a little faster here, unless someone wants to stop and ask questions. This is the idea, again, that teams should define how they're going to do the work. Now, in the Scrum and Agile world, we often talk about the definition of done. And if you look at a well-done definition of done, it's essentially a process. It says, what are the steps? What are the things that we need to do in order to assure quality, in order to assure good results, in order to ensure that we finish in a timely manner, and those sorts of things. Okay. If we look at the complete measurement framework, one of the innovations that Watts Humphrey did with the team software process was to boil measurements down to 4 core measurements, base measures that can be used to derive other measures by using those base measures in combination. So these base measures are things you would actually log and would serve as the raw data for controlling your project in terms of quality, cost, and schedule, right? And so the base measures that we use in TSP are size, effort, schedule, and defects. And that's quite a complete set for base measures to be able to achieve the kind of high level of control that we need to achieve those very, very high performances that we saw mentioned in Capers-Jones reports. How do we do that in TSP and CMMI level 5? We do that through advanced measurement and using those measures effectively. Scrum implies more basic measures, so a subset of these, not a bad place to get started, but it's really the more advanced measures that we want to consider to achieve the best performance and really to achieve that software excellence. This is where I think we have the biggest differences in the quality achievement with the more advanced practices is through the measurement discipline. Okay, the teams we've talked about, the importance of working in the teams. So how do we work in teams is also important. Teams should establish team goals within the team so that they can commit to each other to achieve the goals. And these could be the goals of the sprint. It could be the goals of the release. It could be business goals. We want these teams to be empowered and self-managing so that they can take on the problems themselves and develop the solutions themselves, work in an iterative and incremental way, do iteration planning, and track their iteration execution. We talked about most of these things earlier. Another important part of the framework is to have defined roles so that people know what their role is and what that's a well-defined role and understand their job within the role. Again, this is a common concept between Scrum and TSP. Scrum has fewer roles. It talks about the product owner role and the Scrum Master role. And then the third role is everyone else that's actually doing development on the product, and that includes testing people, DevOps, whatever. our development team members. The TSP elaborates additional roles. Some of them are roughly equivalent to those basic Scrum roles. But again, this is a concept of where we're saying the framework for sure needs to include roles. A good basic set of roles are those provided in Scrum. If a team or an organization finds they need additional roles, they're well-defined additional roles in TSP that they can look to get other ideas. Okay, defined events. These are very basic and common to the framework, and one is the idea of planning. The planning certainly for each iteration, but both in the Agile world and the TSP world, release planning is important to say we're going to plan out across multiple iterations into the future for when we'll have a full product release. Now, in the Agile world, the ideal is that we're delivering working product every 30 days, right? And if that's your environment where you can deliver a complete working product every 30 days, maybe your sprint planning, your iteration planning, in other words, is your release planning. But if you're working on a brand new product, you're developing a whole new airplane from scratch, let's say, as opposed to doing more of a maintenance task, you're going to need to look ahead into the future more. And that's where the release planning is also important. Team meetings are things like the daily coordination meeting. But if we want to go just beyond very basic daily coordination, we can say, let's have a weekly meeting, especially if we are using some of the more advanced metrics, and let's look at how we're doing in our actual measures against our planned measures with a little bit of analysis there so that we can take better corrective action. So those are the more advanced type of team meetings. Product increment review, this is the practice in Scrum where we often demo a product or we look at a finished increment of the product at the end of each iteration, and we get all the necessary stakeholders there to get feedback on the product that's been produced. Again, this is that emphasis on building the right product and getting early feedback on the product. It's an important, great practice.
Daryl, it's Julia.
Yes.
I just want to give you a time check about a little less than 10 minutes.
Okay, yep, thank you. And also retrospectives. Retrospectives are the thing I mentioned before. It's also called a postmortem. Is that long-held good practice of, when you finish an iteration, which you can think of as a little mini project, that you look back on how things went and you talk about what can be done better, either in the distant future or even better in the very, very next iteration, very next cycle. Okay. Defined artifacts. Again, a framework should call out what are the things that we produce. So important work products are the product backlog. These are your requirements. These are the user needs. And it's important to have those ready to go into development in a way that they are prioritized, they're well understood. We need practices around looking at the product backlog items to make sure that they're clear and they're correct and they're understood. And then we need to estimate those while they're in the product backlog, at least at a high level, so that the longer term planning can be done and so that we can select those things to go into the next iteration that will fit in a reasonable way. And then the iteration plans then take items out of the product backlog and do the more detailed planning on what it's going to take to implement those items in that next iteration. The product increment is your output at each iteration of your work from each cycle. Okay. Iteration plans, again, these are the very detailed plans, and that includes at least a team level plan in both Scrum and TSP. We do team level planning. This can be done for Scrum, it's done during your sprint planning. In TSP, we do it in an event called a launch, but exactly the same idea for the iteration plans there. TSP goes into more detail, though. It during the launch breaks out individual level plans. So this could be considered a more advanced practice. The advantage of that is it gives you more of an opportunity up front to do load balancing. It gives you more of an opportunity up front to say, do we need expertise that we don't have on the team? Can we go ask for that, and so on. The plan detail, the quality plan, the risk plan, the iteration length, these are all things that we want to work into the framework as well. Okay. So I want to conclude just with a few statements here, and then hopefully we'll have at least a couple of minutes for some questions or comments. We believe there's enormous opportunities to continue to improve the state of the practice of engineering, produce more valuable software, higher quality, in less time and less cost. Even if you're doing CMMI level 5 or you're doing TSP, there's still more that can be learned from the good ideas that are out there. And if you're doing Scrum, what we're suggesting is don't stop with the basic implementation of Scrum. There are so many good ideas out there to really achieve software excellence. And so we believe the best way to improve the state of the practice is to look for those ideas outside of any one method. Look at how they fit into a framework like this to supplement your primary method and continue to grow. And so really software excellence results from motivated people working on these teams with skills and knowledge, applying these principles and practices, both as individuals and across the teams and across specialties. The success of the DevSecOps movement has just shown how important it is to break down those barriers between specialties as well to get more and more software excellence. Okay. All right. Any questions or discussion? And then we need to close out pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, and feel free to use the chat function if you'd rather, and I can read the question.
Daryl, I have a question for you. There's a lot that we can take from this and use on multiple different teams. Have you thought, or is there a possibility of taking an approach similar to TSP where we define a process that is a blend of the two, or is this more of just tools that are available to help teams on an individual basis?
Yeah, so what I've done so far with this has been my attempt to define a framework for just such a process. And so what we do when we work with our data systems clients is exactly that. We end up defining the client's process specific to that client. It's very hard, I think, just to come up with a generic process and say this is what will work for everybody. I mean, but essentially that's kind of what TSP is. But TSP is a very high level, high maturity CMMI level 5 type of process, right? So it can be a bit overwhelming, right? So I think the ideal would be if we had something in between, like the basic Scrum guide and the fully elaborated TSP to say, here are processes and process increments, right? A lot of work, it's usually best done in the context of a specific organization, right? So yeah, if I'm available, if you want to hire me to help you write something for your organization, we can do that. I think that's the best approach, right? I mean, that's essentially what we do, right? For the community to write something as a whole, I'm all for that too, right?
And that's, Daryl, that's part of the charge of the TSP decomposition working group, wouldn't you say? Is I don't know.
Well, we've been playing around with it. We just haven't gotten a whole lot of traction yet on any one approach. But I think Daryl's absolutely right. It's a kind of a tailored to your organization or the team you're working with kind of thing. I was hoping you had some. We talked about.
Daryl, I thought that was just such a great overview of sort of explaining, the strengths and weaknesses of the two models or approaches and how they can work together. I would love to invite you to come to a future monthly meeting to talk more about your introduction strategy, because I think that is something a lot of organizations struggle with is, what are the right first steps to take, and how do you build on early successes? So I don't know if that's something you'd be interested in, but I would be personally interested, and I would hope the community would as well.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because that was actually something those were the slides I wanted to put in here and said there's not enough time. But
Yeah.
that is also very crucially important, is to have an introduction strategy and to say, even in this incremental approach that I talk about so much, what would that look like in actual execution, and how would you bring that into an organization? Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Daryl, thank you. That was excellent. We're so lucky to have you as a part of our community.